When I look back to where all of this truly began, it wasn't with a grand revelation or a dramatic confrontation. It started quietly, almost tenderly, with me gathering every last ounce of courage I had to sit my family down and tell them something deeply personal. Something that, for me, was simply the truth of who I am. I remember my hands shaking, my heart racing so loudly it drowned out my own voice. I had rehearsed that moment 1,000 times in the mirror, imagining every possible reaction: tears, hugs, maybe even awkward silence. What I didn't prepare for was outright rejection. Their faces changed so quickly, it was like watching a light switch flip off. My mother's eyes went cold first, followed by my father's tense jaw, and the way he folded his arms, distancing himself from me physically, as if being near me suddenly made him uncomfortable. My siblings looked around the room, some confused, some embarrassed, but none of them spoke up for me. The silence that fell was almost more painful than words could have been. Then, finally, the words did come, and they stung. I was told that I was a disappointment, that I was selfish for choosing this life, that I was ruining the family's name, tarnishing everything they'd built. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it with finality, as though a door had been firmly closed and locked. In a matter of minutes, the people I loved most in this world, the people whose approval I had craved since I was a child, made it clear that they would rather erase me than accept me for who I was. I left that day feeling hollow. It was as if someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that made me whole. I wandered through the days that followed in a sort of daze, replaying the conversation over and over, wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have presented my truth in a way that didn't push them away. I even tried to convince myself, briefly, that maybe I could go back to hiding, to pretending to be someone I wasn't, just to keep their love. But deep down, I knew that was no longer an option. It's a strange thing when your entire foundation is ripped away. Family is supposed to be unconditional, the safe harbor when the rest of the world gets rough. So when your family turns their backs on you, it feels like being set adrift with no compass. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, mourning not just their acceptance, but the future memories we'd never make, holidays together, their hugs after milestones, the warmth of belonging. Yet even in that darkness, something small began to stir inside me. A kind of quiet defiance, a whisper that said maybe, just maybe, I could still build a beautiful life, even if it wasn't the one they envisioned for me. It didn't lessen the pain. It didn't suddenly mend my heart. But it was enough to keep me moving, step by shaky step. What I didn't realize then was that their rejection would become the very catalyst that pushed me to discover strengths I never knew I had. That being cast out of their circle would force me to create my own, filled with people who would see me, truly see me, and love me not despite who I am, but because of it. It all started with that devastating moment, sitting across from the people who were supposed to love me most, hearing them say in no uncertain terms that who I am was simply too much for them to bear. Little did they know, they were lighting the very spark that would one day illuminate a path far brighter than any of us could have imagined. In the aftermath of being disowned, I found myself grappling not only with heartbreak, but with a deep uncertainty about who I really was. For so long, my identity had been tied to their approval. I measured my worth by their smiles, their praise, the simple comfort of being included. When all of that was ripped away, I was left with an aching void and a haunting question. Without them, who was I? At first, I tried to fill that emptiness with distraction. I buried myself in work, took long walks that stretched into hours, anything to keep from sitting alone with my thoughts. But there's a funny thing about running from yourself eventually. You tire out, and you're still right there, waiting. I remember one evening in particular, sitting on my small, lumpy couch in a dark apartment, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. Tears blurred my vision, and I realized that for all my attempts to numb the pain, I hadn't once stopped to actually embrace myself. I hadn't even tried. That night was something of a turning point. I decided, almost out of desperation, to stop looking outward for validation and start looking inward. It was awkward at first. I'd stand in front of the mirror, forcing myself to say things I didn't yet believe. You're worthy. You're enough. You deserve love. The words tasted foreign, almost silly. But day by day, I kept at it, and slowly those affirmations began to carve out a small space inside me where compassion could grow. I also started seeking out people and places that reflected back to me the acceptance I was learning to offer myself. I found a local LGBTQ+ group that met every Thursday night at a cozy community center. Walking in for the first time was terrifying. I was sure everyone would see how fragile I was, how much I still felt like an outsider. But instead, I was greeted with warm smiles and gentle questions that invited me to share, to be seen. These strangers listened without judgment, laughed with me, even cried with me. They became the family I had lost, and in their presence, I began to shed the fear and shame that had clung to me for so long. It was through these new connections that I discovered parts of myself I'd never given room to breathe. I started volunteering at LGBTQ+ youth shelters, hoping to offer the kind of encouragement I so desperately needed back when I first came out. Watching those kids blossom when someone simply affirmed their worth, it was like medicine for my own soul. Their courage inspired me to be braver in my own life, to stand taller in my truth. At the same time, I dove into hobbies and interests that had once felt off limits. I took up painting, something my family had always dismissed as frivolous. I spent weekends wandering through art galleries, losing myself in colors and textures that spoke to emotions I couldn't yet name. I even started dating again, cautiously at first, learning through tender, awkward moments what it meant to love and be loved without pretense. Through all of this, I began to build a new identity, one not built on my family's narrow expectations, but on authenticity. I learned to value the small, quiet triumphs, the ease of laughing without censoring myself, the joy of holding someone's hand in public, the relief of knowing I didn't have to hide. I realized that being gay wasn't a burden or a flaw. It was a beautiful, integral part of who I am, woven through every dream, every relationship, every hope I carry. So while my family's rejection once made me question my worth, the journey that followed gave me something far more precious than their acceptance ever could. It gave me back to myself. As I grew more comfortable with who I was, I started to notice a subtle but powerful shift happening inside me. It was almost like a quiet rebellion, a determination not to let my family's rejection be the final word on my life. At first, it was simply about survival, about proving to myself that I could keep going even without their support. But slowly, that drive transformed into something bigger, something almost electric. A hunger to create a life so rich and meaningful that it would drown out every cruel thing they'd ever said. It's strange to think about it now, but their abandonment became my fuel. All those moments of sadness and shame hardened into resolve. I remember countless nights sitting at my small kitchen table, exhausted after long days at work, staring at spreadsheets and scribbling business ideas into cheap notebooks. I wasn't just chasing money. I was chasing a sense of security that no one could ever take from me again. I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet so firmly that even if the entire world turned its back on me, I'd still be unshaken. Looking back, it's clear how deeply personal my ambition was. Every hour of overtime, every weekend sacrificed to work instead of rest, every book I devoured on finance and entrepreneurship, it all traced back to that hollow space left by my family's absence. I needed to fill it with something that proved I was worthy, not only to them, but more importantly to myself. There were plenty of setbacks. I failed more times than I can count. There were deals that fell through at the last minute, bills that piled up faster than I could pay them, days when I wondered if I was completely deluding myself. But whenever the temptation crept in to just give up and accept a smaller, safer life, I remembered the way my parents looked at me the day they shut me out, that cold finality in their eyes, and somehow that pain reignited the fire. It reminded me that I wasn't just building a future, I was reclaiming my story from the people who once tried to write me out of theirs. And it wasn't only about the money, though I won't pretend the financial success didn't matter. Of course it did. But the true victory was deeper. It was about taking the very rejection that once left me feeling powerless and transforming it into a force so strong it could build entire new worlds. It was about proving that I didn't need anyone's permission to thrive, that I could design a life rooted in authenticity and passion, free from the suffocating weight of trying to be someone else's version of acceptable. Over time, as my ventures began to flourish, I felt a quiet sense of triumph, not the loud, gloating kind, but a steady, soul-deep assurance that I had made it through the worst and emerged not just intact, but more alive than ever. Each new milestone felt like stitching up an old wound, turning scars into something almost beautiful. I often wonder if my family ever thinks about me now, if they hear whispers of my success through mutual acquaintances. Maybe they do. Maybe they sit around their dinner table, speaking my name with a mix of regret and disbelief. Or maybe they still hold on to the same narrow ideas that drove me away. The truth is, it doesn't really matter anymore, because the life I've built stands as proof that who I am was never the problem. Their limited love was. Their rejection tried to break me. Instead, it became the spark that lit up everything I've achieved since. And for that, in a strange way, I'm almost grateful. The path to success was anything but smooth, and honestly, I wouldn't trust any story that pretends otherwise. From the outside, it's easy for people to see the comfortable home, the growing business, the confident smile, and assume it all happened effortlessly. But the truth is, every single accomplishment rests on countless moments of uncertainty, struggle, and more than a few outright failures that nearly made me give up entirely. In the beginning, I didn't have much more than raw determination. I didn't have a safety net, no parents to bail me out, no family inheritance waiting in the wings. Every risk felt terrifying, because if it fell apart, there was no one else to catch me. I remember maxing out credit cards just to keep my first tiny venture afloat, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, the numbers spinning in my mind until my chest hurt. There were mornings I'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to muster a pep talk strong enough to quiet the panic rising in my throat. And yet, for all the anxiety, there was also a strange thrill in it, a sense that I was fighting for something truly my own. Each small success felt monumental, landing my first client, getting my first real paycheck that was more than just survival money. I celebrated those moments quietly, sometimes with nothing more than takeout and a long walk under the streetlights, telling myself, "You're doing it, look at you, actually doing it." Of course, the bigger I dreamed, the bigger the setbacks became. I took on partnerships that soured, made investments that tanked, trusted people who saw my naivety as an opportunity to take advantage. I remember the lowest point vividly. I was standing in the rain outside a closed office building, clutching a notice that basically told me my business was about to collapse. I felt humiliated, betrayed by my own ambition. For a few weeks after that, I honestly considered walking away from it all. Maybe I was just meant to live a small life. Maybe my family had been right all along. But something inside me refused to let go. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the lingering sting of rejection that still had me determined to prove my worth. Or maybe it was just that by then, I had fallen so in love with the process of building something that I couldn't imagine not trying again. So I dusted myself off literally on some days and started over. Little by little, things began to shift. I learned from my mistakes. I got smarter about who I trusted, more cautious with money, clearer about my own values and the kind of work I wanted to put into the world. I began surrounding myself with mentors and peers who challenged me, inspired me, and reminded me that setbacks were just part of the story, not the ending. Then came the moment everything seemed to click. A big contract landed in my lap after years of knocking on doors. The numbers finally started adding up in my favor. I hired my first small team, people who believed in my vision and treated me not as a paycheck, but as a partner. Watching them grow alongside me, seeing their families benefit from the opportunities my business could now offer, it filled me with a pride that no amount of money alone could replicate. Standing here now telling this story, I realize that all the sleepless nights and near misses were not detours from success. They were the very forge that shaped it. I wouldn't erase a single painful lesson, because each one brought me closer to the kind of resilience and wisdom I needed to build something that could last. In the end, it wasn't just about getting rich. It was about becoming someone who could weather storms, who could stand tall in the face of doubt, someone who knew beyond question that no rejection, no matter how personal or cruel, would ever be enough to keep me from rising. As I climbed higher in my career and began to see the tangible results of all those sleepless nights and hard-won risks, I also started to wrestle with an unexpected question. What did it really mean to be rich? Because sure, my bank account looked healthier than I ever dreamed it could. I was able to buy the house I once thought only existed in daydreams, take trips that made my younger self gasp with wonder, and give generously to causes I cared about. But the more success I tasted, the more I realized how shallow it would all feel if it was only about stacking money in neat piles. There was a time when I thought that if I became wealthy enough, it would somehow erase the hurt of my family shutting me out. I imagined them hearing about my success and suddenly calling me, voices thick with pride, begging to mend what they'd broken. I fantasized that being the richest one among them would finally make them see my worth. But life doesn't usually wrap things up that neatly. Even as I reached milestones that would have stunned the person I used to be, the phone didn't ring, and there were no letters of apology waiting in my mailbox. And somewhere along the way, I realized that maybe that was okay. Because what I found was something far more profound than external validation. I discovered a kind of wealth that had absolutely nothing to do with money. It showed up in small, everyday moments, like Sunday brunches with friends who felt more like siblings than my own blood ever did. It was there in the way they'd laugh and tease me, in how they showed up with soup and movies when I was sick, or how we could sit together in comfortable silence, needing no explanation for why we belonged to each other. It was in the deep love I found with a partner who didn't just accept who I am, but celebrated it. Someone who held my hand in crowded rooms without hesitation, who looked at me in a way that made me believe I was truly seen. Their love reminded me every single day that I didn't have to earn my right to be cherished. I only had to be myself. I saw this richness most clearly in the quiet moments, cooking dinner side by side, dancing barefoot in the living room to songs only we could hear, sharing dreams about the future that felt limitless precisely because they were rooted in something real. Money could buy us the roof over our heads, the trips we loved taking, the comfort of security, but it was these simple, tender exchanges that made life feel extravagantly full. Beyond my personal relationships, I also discovered deep fulfillment in the work I was able to do for others. The same pain that once left me feeling isolated became the bridge to understanding and lifting up those who still stood where I once did. Mentoring young people, especially those grappling with being rejected by their own families, gave my success a purpose that was so much bigger than me. Seeing their eyes light up with hope, watching them start to believe in their own worth, that was a kind of wealth no sum of money could ever touch. So yes, by most definitions, I became the richest one in my family, at least materially. But the real triumph was how much richer my life became in ways they might never understand. I was surrounded by love that didn't come with conditions or contracts. I had friendships that felt like lifelong shelter, a partner who was both home and adventure, and a community that reminded me every day that being exactly who I am is more than enough. In the end, that's the kind of fortune I wouldn't trade for anything. It took me a long time to reach a place where I could even begin to think about forgiveness. In those early years, I carried my family's rejection like a wound that refused to close. Every reminder of them, a childhood photo tucked into a drawer, an old holiday recipe, the sound of a familiar song felt like salt rubbed into raw skin. I told myself I didn't care anymore, that their opinion no longer mattered. But if I'm honest, that was mostly bravado. Deep down, a part of me still ached for their acceptance, still replayed that awful moment when they decided who I was simply wasn't lovable. But as the years rolled on, and I continued building a life that felt honest and joyful, I noticed that old pain started to soften around the edges. It didn't vanish completely. Heartbreak like that leaves scars too deep to fully disappear. Still, it loosened its grip. I realized that holding on to resentment, clutching it like a trophy, only anchored me to a past I'd worked so hard to move beyond. And ironically, that meant they still held power over me. I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't really about excusing what they did or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about freeing myself. I didn't need their apologies or changed hearts to heal. I just needed to stop carrying the bitterness that weighed down my own. So little by little, I let it go. Not all at once, not perfectly, but like peeling back layers that had long protected a tender, hopeful part of me. At the same time, I found myself reflecting on who they were, the lives they'd lived, the fears they'd probably never confronted. I thought about how their narrow view of love had likely been taught to them in the same rigid way they tried to teach it to me. That didn't excuse the harm, but it did remind me that hurt people often pass along the pain they don't know how to process. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing them as these towering figures with ultimate authority over my worth, and started seeing them as flawed, fragile humans just trying poorly, in this case, navigate their own brokenness. As for reconciliation, the truth is more complicated. A few family members reached out over time, testing the waters with tentative phone calls or awkward messages. Some offered half-formed apologies or clumsy attempts to reconnect that fell short of acknowledging the full weight of what they'd done. Others stayed silent, frozen in the same judgment that drove me away in the first place. I chose to meet each situation with careful openness, not out of obligation, but from a place of hard-won strength. I made peace with the reality that rebuilding certain relationships might never be possible, or even healthy, and that was okay, because I wasn't desperate for their love anymore. Instead, I had built a life so rich with genuine connection that it cushioned me from whatever they could or couldn't give. The family I chose, the one that wrapped around me in laughter and compassion, became more than enough. They taught me that love, real love, doesn't hinge on fitting into someone else's expectations. It's expansive, welcoming, patient. Standing here now, I can say that my family's rejection once felt like it would break me, but it ended up reshaping me into someone more compassionate, more resilient, and more deeply rooted in who I am than I ever imagined possible. Their decision may have shut a door, but it opened countless others, leading me to relationships and experiences that filled my life with meaning in ways their acceptance never could have. In the end, I didn't just survive their betrayal. I transformed it into a life defined by forgiveness, freedom, and a love that finally feels limitless.